Our May speaker will be Cheryl Mack, and she'll be presenting on May 4th on Let Sleeping Bears Lie, Further Research on the Archaeology in the Dark Zone of Lava Tube Caves in Southwest Washington. So anyway, that sounds fun. I've explored a few lava tube caves in Washington, so I'm looking forward to hear what Cheryl has to say. And with that, if I haven't totally bored him to death, Duncan, I hope you're still there and awake. Anyway, so our April speaker is Dr. Duncan McLaren, speaking tonight on searching for late Pleistocene archaeological sites along the western edge of the Cordilleran ice sheet, if I said that right. If not, we'll find out. Dr. McLaren is affiliated with the Hakai Institute, University of Victoria in Cordilleran Archaeology. Tonight's presentation will focus on evidence of the late Pleistocene human occupation of the refugia of this location along the Pacific coast. So, Paula, if you're ready, and if Dr. Duncan McLaren is ready, I'll turn it over to you, Paula. Or shall I just say, let's ask Dr. McLaren to take it away.
Yeah.
Great, okay. Thank you very much for having me here today. I was supposed to be flying down to Oregon last year in order to give this presentation in person. And this is one of the first cancellations I had to make as a result of the COVID lockdown. And so I'm really glad to be able to be here and to give this presentation. I'm just gonna share my screen. If you can let me know if you can see it.
We can see it.
All right. Well, that's great. And am I coming through okay in terms of my audio?
Yes. The connection's great.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I just got to figure out how to advance my slides. All right. Okay. So the research I'm going to talk about today was funded by the Hakai Institute, and Tula, very grateful. They fund a large amount of coastal science in British Columbia, and so we're very grateful for all of their help. Now, we've worked with a number of different First Nations in the research that I'm going to talk about this evening. The Namgis First Nation, Quatsino, Kwagil, Kwantlen, Heldsick, Owikano, and Haida. There's a large number of field workers who have participated in this research. I'm not going to name them all, as well as a number who worked in the lab on pulling together all the results. I'm talking to you today from Victoria, which is my hometown. This is a base for operations, and many of the archaeologists in Victoria have worked on the projects I'm going to talk about today. And very grateful for the good group that we have here that have enabled us to really focus in and figure out how to approach this idea that people were on the western side of the Cordilleran ice sheet very early on at the end of the last ice age. Now, of course, here's a famous image of how people came into the Americas, moving from Beringia south into well, Oregon, as well as other locations south of the ice sheets. In the red over here is what's often referred to as the coastal corridor. We have also the ice-free corridor. And these are two routes which people definitely used. And there's often some debate as to which was the first, but ultimately, I think the evidence shows that both were used, maybe one earlier than the other. And there's quite a bit of evidence that this coastal route was ice-free earlier than the ice-free corridor route. We also hear quite a bit in the media about this possible route by which people came into the Americas at the end, during the last ice age from Europe. Certainly, this has been done away with with the genetic information that is now available, ancient DNA, really this connection doesn't make much sense. But you do see it. This is from National Geographic, and you do see it still out there in the media quite a bit. I think that it makes people from North America, European heritage, feel better. Now, Knut Vladmark, in his seminal publication, 1979, introduced the idea of the coastal corridor to the archaeological community, and this was published in American Antiquity. And he told me that he had hostile reactions to this idea when he presented this paper at conferences, that people did not like this idea. They were really more into the ice-free corridor idea of how people moved at the end of the last ice age into the Americas. Now, Vladmark attributes the original idea of the coastal route to Calvin Husser, who was a palynologist and one of the first people to really clearly understand that the coastal area was ice-free very early on and able to support vegetation. As I said previously, he mentions that really no archaeologists were willing to consider this idea very seriously. He also notes that the earliest sites along the coasts of British Columbia and Alaska at the time, 1979, did not predate 10,000 years ago. And there was no evidence of Clovis or Folsom or any of the earlier tool types that people were finding in the United States. And Vladmark also suggested that it was probably very unlikely anyone would ever find archaeological sites predating this along the west coast of Alaska and British Columbia, as sea level was 100 meters lower than today. Now, this last statement by Vladmark is, as we've pushed sea level history studies, has been shown to be not quite correct. Although on the very outer coast of both British Columbia and Alaska, sea level was on the order of 100 to 150 meters lower than today. But it's a much more complicated story than that. Then we jump ahead to 2019 and Michael Waters, who published a paper in Science. And this is a very interesting graph that he put up in his publication. And he states, genetic studies conclusively show that the first Americans did not originate from Europe as posited by the Solutrean hypothesis. Genetic evidence also does not support a successful occupation of the Americas before 17,500 years ago. And I'll just draw your attention to this first chart here. And the first bars indicate the times when the inland corridor and the coastal corridor would have been covered in ice in blue, and in yellow when they would have been ice-free. So here we see on the coast, Waters suggesting that, really by 16,500 years ago, much of the coast was ice-free. And the inland corridor, really it's about 13,500 years ago that you have ice-free conditions inland. Here he lists 7 archaeological sites that occur very early on that are south of the ice sheets. Deborah Freakin site, Hebure, Schaefer, Page Ladson, Paisley Caves, Manus Mastodon, Wally's Beach, Monteverde, and Huaca Prieta, which are those last two being located in South America. Notably, he doesn't mention Cooper's Ferry, as these two papers were published at about the same time, Cooper's Ferry coming out just a couple weeks after Waters' paper. And Cooper's Ferry has a lot of dates you know, in the 14 to 13,000 range, and also a few that are older, back to 16,000 years. Now, with this in mind, you know, one would think that it's very likely that archaeological sites should be appearing on the west side of the Cordilleran ice sheet during this time to account for these early sites that are found in North America, south of the ice sheets, as well as in South America. I'll just draw your attention to this time period where most of these sites fall is between 15 and 14,000 years. And each one of these sites is indicated by a dot. Now, whenever I radiocarbon date something and it falls within this calibration period, one thing you have to understand is there's a huge plateau, radiocarbon plateau, between 15 and 14,000 years. So for example here, I've just provided an example of radiocarbon age of 12,400 BP. When you calibrate that to 2 sigma, you essentially get a 500-year range from 14,800 through to 14,200. And so this makes it very difficult to pinpoint exactly when some of these sites would have been occupied. We do know that that occupation would happen, you know, between 15 and 14,000 years, but, you know, it's very difficult to start splitting hairs. Anyways, I just thought I'd put that up as an aside. Now, there's been quite a few of these types of maps published recently based on different types of dating techniques that have been used to try to date the timing of when these different corridors would have been accessible. Now, from the ice-free corridor, there's a lot of OSL, optical luminescence dating, that suggests that there was at least some areas of the interior corridor that would have been ice-free around 15,000 years ago. And then one radiocarbon date here, 12,800 years ago. Overall, there's quite a lack of radiocarbon dates from this area that predate 13,000 years. And that's a very different story from the coast here, where you have a beryllium dating on glacial erratics that suggests that they had been dropped out of ice beginning around 19,000 years ago. And I'll get a little more into this beryllium dating a little later. You also have quite a series of radiocarbon dates all up and down the coast that demonstrate, you know, very clear evidence that the outer coast was ice-free by at least 17,000 years ago, in some areas even earlier. This here is a chart of dates from the ice-free corridor presented by Ben Potter et al. In 2018. These authors are very keen on the ice-free corridor, and I have to say I don't think that we should toss the ice-free corridor as an idea. Certainly people were in there very early, but if we look at the red dots here, those are radiocarbon dates. The earliest radiocarbon date here is close to 15,000 years old. Interestingly, when you drill down into where that comes from, it's on a vole, which is a small mouse-like creature that was dated by Richard Hebda from a site in northern BC. And Richard Hebda is also a palynologist, similar to Calvin Husser, and he's a very big advocate of the coastal corridor. So interestingly, he also has done some work in the ice-free area. We also see a lot of these radiocarbon dates 12,500 years ago. Those come from archaeological sites, Charlie Lake Cave, which interestingly enough was excavated by Knut Fladmark, again, a large advocate of the coastal corridor as being the earliest means by which people move south. And some of these other early dates on archaeological sites also come from the Vermilion Lakes site, which Daryl Fedge excavated, also an advocate of the coastal corridor. So, you know, we have quite a few coastal archaeologists and paleontologists who have worked in the ice-free corridor, attempting to find early sites there. Interestingly, we see very few archaeologists who work in the ice-free corridor coming to work on the coast with us. So, you know, I'd like to foster some collegial invitations to anyone who is really keen on the coastal corridor or working on the interior corridor, would be interested in coming and working on the coast. Now, these other dates that they list here are primarily OSL dates, and so they have these massive errors. OSL dating, in my opinion, is you know, pretty much a relative dating technique. You have to be very careful how you use it, and it is not certainly nowhere near as robust as radiocarbon dating. I just contrast this with a single site, Shukaka, or you may also know this as On Your Knees Cave from Southeast Alaska. So this is one single cave in which they have over 100 radiocarbon dates on a number of different animals. These radiocarbon dates span 35,000 years, with a brief hiatus between 20,000 and 17,000 years ago, which is essentially when the glacial maximum occurred. And so you have radiocarbon dates on a number of different animal species. Really solid evidence for there being decent conditions on the coast early on, and conditions that are able to support large land mammals, such as black bear, brown bear, and foxes as well. Notably, there you'll see here at the top, ringed seals are quite common from about 27,000 until 15,000 years ago. And ringed seals are an Arctic species. They prefer much colder water. And so while things were ice-free, they were quite cold. And probably there was quite a bit of sea ice during the winters, which there isn't today in that area. Now we throw in the curveball of changing sea levels as well to the picture here. I'll just draw your attention to this illustration at the top. And one thing that is very complicated when you're working near ice sheet margins or glacial margins is that there is isostatic depression of the Earth's crust. And so the weight of the ice on the Earth's crust resulted in the Earth's crust being depressed. Outer areas that weren't as covered in ice were subjected to what's referred to as a forebulge, so they were pushed up. So at the same time, 14,000 years ago, in Haida Gwaii on the outer coast, sea level was 150 meters lower than today, and then rose to where it is today once the ice on the mainland disappeared. Conversely, the mainland areas were 120 or even 200 meters, sea level was 200 meters higher than today because of the weight of the ice. And areas in between, it's your guess. The elevation of sea level 14,000 years ago will be somewhere in between that. I'll draw your attention to this map at the bottom left of the screen. And here, this is from Potter et al., 2018. They characterized two things. In red, areas where pre-Clovis coasts were below modern, so they would have been, they're submerged, and would be very difficult to find early pre-Clovis sites in these areas that are circled in red. The numbers here is that this coast would be available between 10,500 years till present, but it wouldn't be available earlier, whereas if you go inland here to the Central Coast region, coast here would have been accessible and higher, or high would be at the current sea level or higher between 13.5 to present. So you see outer coastal areas, for the most part, would be very difficult to do this type of archaeology looking for coastal sites. Similarly, the coast of Washington and Oregon, you know, really sea level was quite a bit lower, on the order of 140 meters lower than today. And really it's around 7,000 years ago when the coast stabilized, and you wouldn't really expect to find much in the way of archaeological sites earlier than 7,000 years ago along this coast, except for if it's would have an inland use area. Now, this is a very complicated image to the right here. What this shows is a series of different types of dating. There's the dating of glacial erratics using beryllium. There's in pink here, there's dates on seashells. And you can see these dates are between 15 and 13,500 years ago from the central region. And then additional dates from the eastern region. And in general, what this image is showing is that at the top here, more westerly areas were ice-free around 16.9 thousand years ago. In the central region was ice-free more on the order of 15,000 years ago. And the eastern region had quite a considerable amount of ice in it until around 11.3 thousand years ago. So if you're looking for early period coastal sites, you want to focus on these areas that were ice-free earlier. But the problem with that, as we've seen with this image in the bottom left, is that sea level was much lower in those areas. So there's this kind of sweet spot in the middle where sea level was more stable, and in some places higher than today, as indicated by all these shell dates, most of which come from inland or raised settings above sea level. And this is the kind of area, it would be colder than, say, the outer coast and maybe less productive, but you don't have as much ice. So this is the type of area that we've been targeting in our field program. But it takes a lot of work, as you can see, to get to this point. Okay, next slide. Now, we don't approach this coastal corridor as something that is a given or something that we necessarily believe in. Rather, we approach it more as a testable hypothesis. And to test it as a hypothesis, we look at you know, ways in which we can go about getting at this, looking for archaeological sites. Much of what we have to do is paleoenvironmental work even before we can get at the archaeology, and I'll get into that a little bit more. But anyways, first of all, it requires evidence of glacial refugia, so places that were there was less ice. And that's what we get at from the paleoecological information. It also precludes that people had a good working knowledge of watercraft, and that human populations were adapted to using marine and intertidal resources. I mean, certainly there would have been some terrestrial animals around, but you know, having the ability to use marine and intertidal resources would certainly up your ability to gain a caloric return. We developed a series of research steps in which we need to go through in order to really pinpoint places that are good to look for these types of archaeological sites. So first of all, know where to look in areas that would have been ice-free, create a localized sea level history curve, generate detailed bare earth digital elevation models using LiDAR or other types of geomatic devices, create archaeological predictive models, ground truth those models using archaeological prospection, and demonstrate that archaeological materials found are late Pleistocene in age using stratigraphy and radiocarbon dating. Ultimately, our approach is an inventory-based approach, so we're not setting up at a site for 20 years to excavate it in detail. We're trying to get to as many places to test for archaeological deposits as we can in order to find a place that's really, you know, provides solid and great evidence for early human occupation of the coastal area. If you want to learn more about these discovery models, a recent publication in Paleo America goes into depth into this. Now, as I said before, one of the underlying assumptions is that people were using watercraft early on. And this is something that people have trouble getting their head around, is that humans have used watercraft for a very long time. And they've used watercraft for ocean crossings and inhabited coastal areas where they've gathered resources using watercraft. And this is a great example. And it's a Kozushima obsidian source, which was exploited in the Upper Paleolithic period. You find this obsidian on Honshu Island, a larger island to the north of Kozu Island, where the obsidian source is, down here. And this would have required a crossing by boat between 15 and 25 kilometers. And here you can see this is an artist's conceptual painting of Kozu Island in the background. And they have these kayak or umiak type watercraft. And here this guy is checking out his obsidian haul. And as I've said before, if you're going to make this crossing in one of these boats, I suggest you don't open up your obsidian while you're doing the crossing in case it washes over the side of your boat. Anyhow, we do have great paleoenvironmental indicators suggesting that areas from a variety of different places on the coast of British Columbia were ice-free very early on. So first of all, Calvert Island on the central coast here. I'll talk a little bit more about this area. It's quite interesting in terms of its sea level history. It's not right out on the west coast, but there is a paleosol that has been identified in a beach erosion cut with radiocarbon dates between 15,000 and 14,700 years ago, indicating it was ice-free. From a cave on Haida Gwaii, K1 cave, there's brown bear bones dating between 17,600 and 17,100 years old. At Cape Ball, there's a pollen sequence that begins 19,000 years ago and continues without interruption up until recent times. On the Sultan River, east side of Vancouver Island, willow leaf and barnacle dating to 16,200 years ago. Port Eliza Cave here, which is a raised sea cave, has a number of different bones dating between 20,000 and 19,000 years ago, including mountain goat and marmot. Now, of course, much of the landscape here in white is now drowned, but at that time, between 20,000 and 14,000 years ago, these areas would have been flat plains, and there would have been a lot more land. And just there would have been ice in these troughs, we figure, but much of these outer coastal low-lying islands would have been ice-free. And as sea level rose, it drowned these islands. This area here is now a fishing area, a local fishing area. It's quite well known as Goose Bank, and it's 100 meters under the ocean surface. Now I'll talk a little bit about this area here, which is where we're focusing a lot of our research today and in the next couple of years. Again, local sea level history is really important to know. Here's radiocarbon years before present, calendar years before present here, and elevation below and above the modern shoreline. So if I was going to look for archaeological sites in Victoria, in the Victoria area where I live, that date to 14,000 years ago, not quite early enough to account for Cooper's Ferry, but still it would be not bad. I'd have to look around 50 meters above sea level. Conversely, if I was out at Haida Gwaii looking for a 14,000-year-old site, I'd need to have a submarine or a newt suit and be going 140 meters below the ocean. Talk a little bit about where we've been, some of the different projects that we've been enacting this program, stepwise program to look for early human occupation of the coast. And I'm going to start with discussing looking at ancient shorelines and trying to find sites along ancient shorelines. So this is Calvert Island, and it's gives you an idea of, it's not your sort of typical thick coastal forest, rather it's this bog forest land. This is what we do. We hike canoes in to small little lakes and ponds in order to take sediment cores at the bottom of these lakes. This is one of these sediment cores. You can see here lake bottom sediments transitioning from highly organic sediment into a clayier substrate, and down here into a very glacial proximal gray clay. And we take small samples, cubic centimeter samples from different parts of these cores, and then look at the fossil diatoms, which are essentially phytoplankton that have a silica shell. And we're able to identify freshwater species and marine species. So this particular core came from a lake that's 10 meters above sea level. We didn't find any marine diatoms in any of these sediments, so we know that this lake has been freshwater and not inundated by ocean waters since 14,500 years ago. Conversely, if we found marine diatoms here, we would know that sea level was 10 meters higher than today, 14,000 years ago. So that's the general principle we use. And from these cores, as well as a number of other proxies, we're able to create relative sea level curves. And so this is a sea level curve for the Hakai area. And here, again, at 14,000 years ago, sea level's almost at zero. So it's almost equal to where it is today. So much unlike other areas on the coast, the sea level in this area has remained very stable. It's sort of between the regions to the west, where sea level is much lower, and the regions to the east, where sea level was much higher. And we refer to this as a sea level hinge, the area in between. Now, using this, we decided, well, this would be a great idea to go and have a look for archaeological sites dating to around 14,000 years ago by testing in the upper intertidal zone, different areas on Calvert Island. I should also mention that in this particular area, there's an extremely deep shell midden on the order of 6 meters deep that was occupied during the Holocene. So we know this area was a really good place to hang out later on. Sea level was very stable, so it was most likely a great area to hang out even earlier. And here we are testing in the upper intertidal. The reason we're testing it here is that we came across in a shovel test right here, a single footprint in 2014. And we didn't think too much about that. We weren't even sure what we'd come across. It really looked like a footprint. Then we found a little bit of wood in the footprint and sent that off for radiocarbon dating, and got back dates about 13,250 years old. And again here, 13,100 years old. So we went back to this site and opened it up and began finding additional footprints. And we were almost in disbelief that we found these other footprints. We weren't really certain what we had in the shovel test. But with expansion, we found 29 footprints. We got some images of them. Here you can see they're kind of difficult to discern. Sometimes they're overprinted. You can see that they're pressed into this gray clay, and they're just sitting on top in this paleosol that's on top of this clay. And then there's this wash of brown sand that's come in and filled them. And after that, subsequent beach deposition, which buried them. We found that taking photos was difficult. They didn't look as good as they did in the field. But then when we contrast adjusted them, you can really see the footprints stick out. Here you can see individual toes. You can see the arch of the foot as well as the heel. And one thing that we really note and found was what are called sediment displacement rims. And these are areas around the footprints that are raised. When you press your foot into a wet, clayey substrate and pull it out, it'll make this little raised rim all around the footprint. Now, this is a gumboot print here that's fresh, and this one's one tide cycle old, so the tide has washed away and obscured it a bit, but you can still see the sediment displacement rim. And that's why we were able to find these and excavate them. We'd hit that sediment displacement rim first, and as soon as you hit it, you'd know that you were going to come down on another footprint. Here's one. It's a smaller sized footprint, and this is a rock that's sitting on top of it, so it was deposited later. And we were able to excavate around this and pull it out for, eventually we hope it'll be part of a museum display. So a total of 29 footprints found. More are present but are obscured by repeated trampling. The footprints are associated with preserved plant remains, mostly Pinus contorta or shore pine, dating between 13,300 and 12,700 cal BP. There are 3 distinct lengths of the footprints, 15, 21, and 25 centimeters, which does conjure up some idea of nuclear family, maybe a child and 2 adults. And there are probably lots more of these footprints in the adjacent intertidal zone, but we ceased excavations in 2016. This site is located in the Conservancy, and in that spirit, we decided not to excavate more there and to preserve this site for future generations. We also ended up working at a site on the very outer central coast here. This is Tricket Island. And here we're looking to the west. It's a bit foggy, but really the next stop is the open Pacific Ocean and Japan. So it's a little protected beach here on the lee side of the island. And in this area, there are these beautiful intertidal flats, which are incredibly highly productive for shellfish. And this is an excavation unit. We went through the site with augers and small coring devices to get a preliminary idea of the deposits. And we ended up finding in this one area, 70 meters inland, sort of a layer cake of deposits, including peat, and shell midden, and more peat, and then some sandy deposits at the bottom. The earliest radiocarbon date is 14,000, between 14,000 and 13,700 years ago, and is associated with a cluster of stone tools sitting on this rock. It's almost like someone made all these flakes, and there's a core here as well, and took the best flakes that they wanted and left the rest sitting on this rock, and then they were buried by the sand. Now there's also, after 11,500 years ago, faunal remains are preserved, including mussel shell. Because you have these peaty deposits, we also get early Holocene examples of wooden artifacts. And here's a bark wrapped stick, probably a tool handle, and that had maybe a microlith poking out the top. Incredible collection of faunal material dating between 11,500 and 5,000 years. And Alicia Govro from the University of Victoria is currently writing up the results from this work as part of her PhD dissertation. This gives you a close-up. This is an artist's rendition of what this cluster of artifacts here would have looked like. And here they are as they're being revealed in situ. You can see there's a little paleosol here, and we've looked really hard for more material to date in it, and we used up all the charcoal we could find in this one date. And nothing else we've found in that paleosol is identifiable. There's some little mushy bits, but we're not comfortable in dating those because they could be roots. We also undertook intertidal excavations at this same site. And here, this is just a preliminary shovel test. When we found quite a heap of lithics in that shovel test, we opened it up into this slightly bigger than a 1x1 because we were going with the plywood dimensions. Here you can see the tides coming in, and so we're racing to finish our excavation before this tide comes in, and we're about 2 meters below the tide level. Very stressful work. Ultimately, the stratigraphy was all mixed up and everything was in a secondary context. But we found fairly nice lithics, some spear point bits, more foliate, Lancelot type projectile points, as well as stone tools with little barnacles on them. And even though these artifacts are in secondary context, these barnacles allow us to date when these artifacts were last on the surface. And so we do get dates back to 10,700 years. And we did this testing hoping that we could dig deep enough down to get back into 13 and 14,000-year-old deposits, but we just couldn't do it with the equipment we had. Anyhow, it turned out to be a really good exercise because we are able to date these artifacts even in secondary context because of the barnacles on them. And so one thing that we're thinking about now is maybe we want to go to places where the shoreline was about where it is today, 14,000 years ago, and really begin doing these intertidal tests to see if we can find more tools with barnacles on them, perhaps even older than these. So that's sort of how we operationalize looking for ancient shorelines and then testing on them, and then some of the results that we find. Another method that we've been toying with is looking in karst caves. And so I'm going to talk about 2 karst cave. There's actually 3 caves, 2 in this location and 1 in this location, in Haida Gwaii. Of course, sea level was much lower during the late Pleistocene period in Haida Gwaii. So going and looking in caves allows us to look at a place that would have attracted animals and perhaps humans to an inland location. And here is K1 Cave. It's on the west side of Moresby Island, the southern island, large southern island in Haida Gwaii. And this is me much younger, excavating in this Locus 11. Here we found essentially ancient bear den dating between 13,800 and 12,500 years ago. Interestingly, 2 spear point fragments within these heaps of bear bones. And we were able to date bones on either side of these spear points. They're coming back 12,800 to 12,500 years old, made from a chert which is locally available. Here, this is a brown bear mandible. You can see the canine tooth here. You know, really quite an amazing preservation in this karst landscape of animal bone. This is Gadu Din Cave on the east side of Haida Gwaii. Again, many bear bones, as well as salmon bone and caribou, deer, many other species in this cave, as well as large spear points, a bone point, and a retouched flake. These objects date between 12,500 and 11,500 years ago. And so by focusing rather than on the shoreline, but on inland targets, we were able to find very early sites. Of course, it'd be very difficult to get to this little island that these caves are on unless you used watercraft, and we're quite proficient at it. Now, interestingly, from this same cave, Gadu Din 1, there were these teeth found, 2 canines and a premolar from a canid, which is was then submitted in 2005 to Jody Barta at McMaster University for mitochondrial DNA analysis. And she came back and said that this is the DNA, mitochondrial DNA clad for these teeth is domestic dog or wolf. And these date to 13,500 years ago. So I did a little more digging in on this clade, mitochondrial DNA clade. And most of the wolves, or almost all the wolves from this clade, are found in Romania and Greece and Turkey and Iran. None of this clade are known from North America. And it's thought that that specific clade of wolf is a result of wolves mating with a dog and gave rise to those wolves. In North America, this mitochondrial clade does appear, but only in dogs. But there's still a chance these might be wolf teeth. 13,500 years ago is very early for dog. There is no earlier dog known in the Americas. So I did a little test and measured, went to a thesis where I found a number of measurements of the width of the canine tooth at the enamel line for wolves. Just happened that this was done by this master's student. And here you can see the average width of the canine tooth between 14 and 16 millimeters. This last category, she measured domestic dogs. So those are between 9 and 16 millimeters. And here, that's the Gadu Din teeth. Very small, and almost definitely a dog, a small dog, 13,500-year-old small dog. So of course, domestic dog is a very good proxy for people being there as well. Northern Vancouver Island, we also have done, in the past, we've done some cave exploration work. This is a P2 cave, and it's quite an amazing place. You can almost drive a truck through it, over 2 kilometers of passages. In this cave, 3 species of bear were found: short-faced bear, brown bear, black bear, as well as mountain goat, and a number of other species. Interestingly, this has recently been published by Martina Steffen and Fulton, 2018. Here, Ursus arctos is brown bear. Brown bear doesn't live on Vancouver Island anymore, although you do have a rare sighting. And here, dating 14,800 to 14,200. Then you have short-faced bear here, come in the early 13,000s. And then Ursus arctos, or brown bear, reappearing around 13,000 years ago. And so it looks like these bears were first brown, and then they left. Then short-faced bear came in, and then was once again replaced by brown bear. And there's quite a bit of evidence that these 2 species were quite competitive. I'm also just going to throw in this, the Manus Mastodon site, which most people know about, dating around between 14,000, 13,700. This is an image from Michael Waters et al., 2011, and shows this bone point, another bone point in this Mastodon rib. And this is, for a long time, was held up as the earliest site in the area, and really still is in many ways, and is pretty good evidence. Some people have questioned whether this might be some kind of natural accident getting that bone point in there. And as far as I know, no one's ever pulled it out to have a closer look at it. Okay, so well, that brings us to more recent field operations where we've been focusing, as I said previously, on northern Vancouver Island. And northern Vancouver Island is quite interesting to us for a number of reasons. First of all, especially the very northern end of the island is located quite far away from where the major ice would have been coming out of the mainland. And so we reasoned that, you know, this very western region and Top Knot Lake would have been ice-free very early. It also has quite a bit of karst, so quite a bit of potential for getting into caves and seeing if we can push that story a little bit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing in northern Vancouver Island for the last couple of years. First about Top Knot Lake here, where we cored this lake in 2018. And it's about 13 meters above sea level. And it demonstrates to us, it has an 18,000-year-old record. So first of all, it demonstrates that this place was ice-free over the last 18,000 years, but it has no record of there being any ocean water in this basin. So we know that sea level was below 13 meters over the last 18,000 years. Conversely, at Port Hardy, our coring work in this area has shown sea level was 40 meters above sea level 15,000 years ago. And I just draw your attention to this area here. It's called Quatsino Sound, and it's this west to east inland sea, essentially. It has these two arms here, Holberg Inlet and Nertosis Inlet here. And we kind of figured that because this area is in between a place where we figure sea level was lower than present and higher than present, that there may be another sea level hinge in this inland sea. So it's an area we've been focusing quite a bit of attention. We've also been looking at the Wash and Nimkish River drainage area. And this has the largest salmon runs today on Vancouver Island. And we have some environmental sedimentary DNA records from Little Wass Lake that are 14,000 years old that show that salmon were in Little Wass Lake 14,000 years ago. So we know that this has been an active salmon river over the last 14,000 years. Now this area is more mountainous and probably had quite a bit more glacial effects, at least earlier than 14,500 years ago. So we wouldn't expect to have an earlier record here. Whereas this more northerly area, it could. This is just a sequence of radiocarbonates from Top Knot Lake, the lake on the northwest side. Here going back to 17,000 years ago. And there's pollen. I'm sorry about the quality of this image. Pollen in this same core has been analyzed by Chris Hebda as part of his master's program, which is now finished. And we get pollen far below our lowest date. So here, this date of 17,000 really seems to be the beginning of a time period when there's very little arboreal pollen. But prior to that, we see that there's quite a bit more arboreal pollen, which kind of almost suggests that this time frame before 17,000 years ago was a little more productive. We've undertaken a coring program where we've worked from east to west across the North Island, using Quatsino Sound here to access a lot of lakes. And from this, we're getting really excellent sea level information. On the very west side here, I'm going to talk from west to east here. As I said before, 13 meters is where Top Knot Lake is, and sea level was below that level over the last 17,500 years ago, probably more. In the more middle range here, Sea level was near modern, so we're looking at kind of a hinge-like area between 15 and 14,500 years ago. Further to the east, it was 40 meters higher, and even further to the east, 90 meters higher at this same time. So it's kind of the expected pattern, but now we have some target elevations to begin to look at. And this area here in the middle, this hinge area, is quite appealing to us to look at because there are a large number of intertidal lithic sites in this area. And so we're now beginning to think this would be a really good area to begin to doing intertidal operations. This is a map showing all of the cave sites that we've visited over the last 3 years. I think it's on the order of 27 caves. Most of them are in the more mountainous region to the east that was likely covered in at least localized ice until 15,000 years ago. We looked at some sea caves on the west side here, but these all come back with amazing amounts of faunal remains in these caves, but they're all late Holocene assemblages. And we haven't quite started looking in this Holberg area. We've had a look at some very active caves, which aren't so good for our purposes. We prefer to look at inactive caves or caves where the streams are no longer active. However, we have put together quite an interesting look, quite an interesting assemblage of faunal remains from these caves. This is an example of one of them. It's called Dreamtime Cave. It's in the more mountainous region, limestone cave. Here you can see this is a bare earth DEM, digital elevation model. You can see a road here cutting through a logging road, another logging road here, a creek valley here, and here, this is the sinkhole associated with Dreamtime Cave really stands out. So we can use this LiDAR-derived data in order to help us find and pinpoint cave locations. This is just a view from inside the cave looking out. We went into this cave for a couple hours, found a marmot bone on the surface, and it dates to 11,400 years ago. And a crew went into a back chamber using harnesses and ropes and found this, which is the top of a mountain goat skull, and it dates 14,500 years old. This is a resonance cave, also in the more easterly areas. It's a keyhole-shaped cave, and it's incredibly long. It's called Resonance Cave because you can be about 200 meters in it and whispering, and people at the entrance can hear you. And in this cave, there have been more mountain goat found. Mountain goat aren't found on Vancouver Island today, but they certainly enjoyed living there in the late Pleistocene. There are mountain goats on the mainland. This is Ursus Cave, again in the eastern drainage, more easterly drainage area. And it was exposed by a road crew that blasted the limestone face in this area and exposed a little hole. And a caver named Peter Curtis went in there with ropes and harnesses. And this is a natural drop. Oh, my apologies. It drops 5 meters into a bell-shaped pit, and at the bottom is an unimaginable amount of animal bone. And it seems that this bone on the surface, this is a bear skull on the surface, really the dates of the bone on the surface are around 12,000 years old, so we figure this cave has been sealed for 12,000 years. Just gives you a better view of some of the bones on the surface. Here is another bear skull, a long bone. It's a bit of a spooky place to work. There's all these scratch marks on the walls, about 1.5 to 2 meters above the surface. And this is obviously these bears getting trapped in this natural pit and not able to get out. This is me. I was the only person allowed to go into this cave because it was kind of freaky to get in there. You had to do a drop into it feet first with harnesses. And here you can see we set up a single 50 by 50 centimeter unit just to test the sediments. Here we dug down over a meter, as far as my arm would reach. And these top 50 centimeters are pretty much more bone than sediments in those 50 centimeters. Over 3,000 bones came out of this 50 by 50 centimeter pit. Gives you an idea of these bones. They date between 12,000 and 14,500 years old. Frog was surprising to me. Shrew, vole, squirrel, Vancouver Island marmot, quite a bit of Vancouver Island marmot. Fox isn't known from Vancouver Island, and we've had some ancient DNA work done on this, and it is red fox, although it's a diminutive red fox, much smaller than the mainland foxes. Wolf, quite a bit of black bear, and some other bits and pieces. One other cave, this one's a little further to the west, and it's a really nice cave. Again, keyhole shaped. It's only about 13 meters long, and then it's choked with sediment, so it can't get further back. This is the back end of the cave that is choked, and from the surface, right back in here, we found deer bone dated to 13,500 years ago, bear bone 10,500 years ago, and a bone that's identified as wolf or dog, 13,600 years old. We have yet to do ancient DNA work on this wolf slash dog to see if we can figure it out a little bit better. We again dug a small 50 by 50 centimeter test. In the very top 20 centimeters is a beautiful chert flake. But we're not exactly sure where it came from. We found it in the sediments we brought back to the lab, of course. There is a radiocarbon date from 20 centimeters below surface. That's around 12,500 years old. Again, here we have similar types of species. Vancouver Island marmot's quite important. Fox shows up again. Wolf or large dog, 2 elements of that. Black bear, etc. We also took a 1 cubic centimeter sample of sediment from 20 centimeters below surface and submitted it for sedimentary DNA. And that analysis came back with 95 strands of Chinook salmon DNA, 77 deer mouse, 66 strands of wolf, 32 strands of red fox DNA, 10 strands of bear in general to genus level, 8 strands of domestic dog. And as you can see, there's brown bear as well. We didn't find any brown bear bones, but it would seem that brown bear was in here. Sea otter, which surprised us. Anna's hummingbird, alpine marmot. Marmot, quite common in these caves. And there are more than this. Incredible amounts of fungal and bacterial DNA as well, which we don't really know what to do with. This is the Vancouver Island marmot. It's an endangered species today. I think that there's maybe 200 of them left on Vancouver Island. Apparently, it's a distinct species from the marmots found on the mainland. But we find these marmots in these much lower elevation caves than they're ranged today. They tend to prefer subalpine and alpine areas. But in the late Pleistocene times, of course, much of Vancouver Island was less treed than it is now. And there would have been extensive, far larger alpine areas. And so we figure that these little critters were really, at their peak in the late Pleistocene was much colder. And it's very likely that, if there is any species that can demonstrate that there was a glacial refugium, it's these critters. They were found in Port Eliza Cave, which is on the west side of Vancouver Island, dating to 19,500 years ago. So if we look at all the species, a number of the species that have been found in these caves, as well as the top knot pollen record, we found mountain goat occurs before we figure that the glacial maximum must have been in this zone here between 19 and 18,000 years ago. And that kind of lines up with what was found in Oniernese Cave in Southeast Alaska. Maybe that's a bit longer, 19 to 17,000 years ago. It was quite cold. Here we have mountain goat before and after. From Port Eliza, there's sparrow, vole before and after. Here's your Vancouver Island marmot appearing before and afterwards, as well as from the other caves. There's deer, brown bear, which disappear soon after 13,000 years ago. Short-faced bear, which disappears before 13,000 years ago. Black bear, red fox, which has also disappeared. Wolf and dog. We also have this top-knot pollen record, and it's clear that if we were to look in caves more to the west and north, we might be able to find species, animal species in this zone here, where they are absent now. But clearly, before 15,000 years ago in the more mountainous areas of Vancouver Island, it was a lot colder, and we don't find any bones before this 15,000-year-old mark here. So with all this paleo environmental data, we're very interested in that, but ultimately we want to use this data to get at archaeology. And so we've spent a lot of time in this area, also looking at archaeological sites, recording them, inventorying them, looking at what kind of tools there are. Primarily there are stone tool sites, lithic sites, and then running radiocarbon dates. And for the most part, we end up finding early Holocene or mid-Holocene sites. And sometimes we fluke out and tap into something that has a little earlier age to it. So this is one site I'm going to talk about. It's called the Bottleneck Site. And here you can see, this is the Wass River. And this is Little Wass Lake, where I talked about the salmon being 14,000 years old from the ancient DNA from the sediments in this lake. So we know this river system here had a very good salmon run, and it flows into the Nimkish system, which has the largest salmon run on Vancouver Island, and I think it's the 5th largest salmon run in British Columbia. So it's a massive salmon run. It's located in Namgis territory, and this is a map of Namgis territory here. And Nimkish River sort of forms the backbone of Namgis territory. Namgis currently live in Alert Bay. That's the center of their operations. Here, this is the Wass River that flows this way. And the reason this is called the Bottleneck Site is because it's located here in this bottleneck of the oxbow. This is how the site was initially found. It has a terrace that's been cut by the river, and there's a number of stone tools that have fallen out of the site. So this is an example of one of these stone tools. It did a lot of discoidal cores and a lot of flake tools, what we found. Most of the assemblage dates between 10,241 and 8,816, but we have tapped into a 13,500-year-old layer that's well encapsulated. And this is what I wrote last year, but no definite stone tools yet. But we have found some flaky bits down there, nothing yet to write home or publish a manuscript in science about. This is John Maxwell here, just showing this 13,000-year-old layer at where this gray sand begins. It's working off the cut bank. We've also done some inland tests. And we work very closely at the site with the Namgis First Nation, and so this is Leroy Wadhams here, who's from Namgis, working the wet screen. It's an example of a large flake tool. This is quite typical of what we find at this site. Really haven't found too much in the way of bifacial technology. Here you can see these this nice core or scraper tool, hanging out of the wall. And this is around 10 to 11,000 years old. You can see the really orange sediments there. Complex stratigraphy here, the gray sand at the bottom, these dates of 13,500 and even a little bit older. And then the component above it to 10,500 years old. We had a visit from the local elementary school from Alert Bay. And these kids came out and just had a blast out with us on site. This was 2019, so before all the COVID restrictions came in. So in our next steps, as I said before, we really want to get back into Quatsino Sound, and we're gearing up to do this in September of this year to begin looking in depth at the intertidal lithic sites. Some intertidal lithic sites in Quatsino Sound were found in the early 1970s by Roy Carlson, Phil Hobler, and Brian Apland, who did inventory work in this area. And there's a lot of cobble chopper, discoidal core type technology being used. Again, there's not too much in the way of bifacial technology, but we'd like to get back in here, see if we can replicate to some degree what we did on Tricket Island and excavating in the intertidal zone, perhaps fluking out and finding some stone tools with barnacles on them, see if we can date sites in the sea level hinge area. We're also looking at going back into this Holberg Inlet area where there's a lot of limestone and karst development, seeing if we can start getting into karst caves that are further to the west and maybe inactive karst caves to see if we can push the record back and maybe also find a cave with a human presence in it dating before 14,000 years. So what have we learned? Well, glacial refugia, some which are interstadial events, are known from paleoenvironmental studies dating between 19,000 and 14,500 years ago on the outer shores of BC. Looking for archaeological deposits dating to this period requires a good knowledge of geomorphic change. When Flabark proposed the coastal corridor in 1979, no archaeological sites predating 10,000 Cal BP were known in the region, with the possible exception of Manus Mastodon. And clearly from what I've talked about today, that has changed. Starting in 2001, operations in karst cave features resulted in finding archaeological remains dating to 12,800 to 12,500 Cal BP. Operations on relict shorelines using relative sea level curves resulted in the discovery of archaeological remains as old as 14,000 to 13,700 Cal BP. Research is ongoing on northern Vancouver Island, and more results are to come. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, thank you. At this moment, I'd like to encourage people to write in the chat or to unmute themselves to ask questions. The question I had from a presentation, you said that the sea otter in one of those caves surprised you. Why is that? It wasn't sea otter extremely prevalent on Haida Gwaii or around Haida Gwaii?
That cave is on northern Vancouver Island and about 40 kilometers from saltwater.
Okay.
And we figured that in its location that it wouldn't have been much closer to saltwater at the time. The 12,500 years ago, sediment from the eDNA dates to. But it may have come in a bear, which is possible.
I hear anyone else out there trying to ask a question? Thought I heard a microphone. Here's one coming through the chat. See, how is it that Cooper's Ferry is relying on Ainu type biface work, yet the tools that you are finding miss this?
We do see some similarities with at least some of the spear points from the caves in Haida Gwaii. And I cut a section of this presentation out to shorten it up. Talks about over 12,000-year-old stem points from the mainland. Cooper's Ferry does have some very distinctive type points, but I would say that they're not out of character to what we find in some places. We do find stem points. We do find a lot of foliate type points as well. Now, I know Lauren Davis, who is a primary author and researcher at Cooper's Ferry, has been to Haida Gwaii with Daryl Fedge in order to 3D scan the artifacts from the caves, as well as other sites in early Holocene sites in Haida Gwaii. And I guess the idea is that he will be comparing those to the Cooper Ferry's point, as well as those that he's scanned in Japan and other places.
Thank you for that. Bob, did you have a question? Looks like Bob Vroman, you're unmuted. Did you have a question? Yeah, we can't hear you.
You unmute that one, big one.
We heard that.
Okay.
Yes, still can't hear you. Anyone else have a question this evening?
Harvey has his hand raised.
Yeah. A question I thought, or if I recall, I heard during his lecture that they found an obsidian tool. Where did the obsidian come from?
When we find obsidian, it tends to be really, you find it in early Holocene. We don't find much of a record of it earlier than that. We did find it at Tricket Island. It's also known in very earliest Holocene from Namu. That particular obsidian comes from Anaheim Peak, which is east of Bella Coola. So in the coast mountain ranges of BC. There are several other obsidian sources in BC, including Mount Zaidza, and that's found near Sitka as well in the earliest Holocene.
Looks like we had another one come in on the chat, and it says, with the glacial hinge that you nicely presented, is there accounting for the subduction / tsunami presence that also existed on Vancouver Island as we have along the Pacific coast?
Yes, we do see most of the isostatic and eustatic changes that occur with sea level occur as a result during the late Pleistocene as a result of massive glaciation. But in the Holocene, so for the last 11,000 years, we do see sea level change. It's on a more minor level than it was previously, and it's mostly as a result of tectonic factors. Now, we have also found tsunami deposits in the peat deposits at Tricket Island. Those date to 6,500 years ago. We find it in multiple places on that island. So there are other lakes where we think we have tsunami deposits as well from the cores that we've taken. So they do show up, but if we have a major tsunami every 300 years, every 400 years, that would be totally expected.
All right, anybody else with questions this evening? All right, Duncan, I'd like to thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and hope everyone has a great Tuesday night.
Thank you.
Great presentation. Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you.